One of the most common questions we get here at Photorec.tv is, how can I take epic wildlife photos? And well, that can mean very different things to different people, from birds in the bird feeder in your backyard to going to the local park and getting some fantastic shots. Well, I've got tips, tricks, and gear recommendations for you for shooting with longer lenses. Let's talk about lenses. Typically, wildlife photography is most interesting when your wildlife fills the frame, and wildlife is usually fairly shy and you need to stay a long distance away from it to avoid spooking it. Really, you need at least 400 millimeters in my opinion, and if you can get longer, you're going to get better photos. One of the best budget lenses is the Sigma 150-600 Contemporary, but I've got picks for cameras and lenses at all different budgets for wildlife photography linked right down below this video. And of course, if you've got questions, leave them down in the comments and we'll get to them. Let's talk about shutter speed. It's critically important when you're working with these longer lenses. You should follow the focal length rule, and that means that your shutter speed should be at least twice your focal length. I'm shooting out at 400 millimeters on a full frame camera, so my shutter speed should be at least 1/800th of a second. That's going to avoid any shake or blur in your image from you. Now, it doesn't take into account your subject. If you're photographing a faster moving subject, say a bird in flight, and you want out to the very tips of the wings to be sharp in focus, then you're talking about shutter speeds that may be as high as 1/2000th of a second. So you have to really watch out for that. And what you'll find is, even in great light, at those higher shutter speeds, your ISO is very likely creeping up, especially since when you're out at 400 or 600, your aperture range isn't great usually either. So what I do is make sure that I get those sharp shots where I know my shutter speed is high enough to freeze all of the action. But after I get those great sharp shots, I'll start to walk that shutter speed back down, which will allow me to lower that ISO for slightly cleaner images. Most of these super telephoto lenses have image stabilization, which allows you to cheat that focal length rule and get a little bit lower. And of course, if you've stabilized it either on a beanbag or a gimbal or a tripod, then you can cheat that rule a little bit more. But again, you have to keep in mind your subject that you're photographing. I'll always trade off higher ISO, slightly noisy images for one that might be blurry. I don't want that because that's unfixable in post. We only need to spend a few minutes talking about aperture. Typically, I shoot at the widest available setting because, as I just said in that last segment, you're battling those higher ISOs, and wider apertures help keep that a little bit lower. Reasons that you might want to stop down. If you find that your lens is a little bit sharper as you stop down, that might be a reason. Another thing to think about is when you're shooting at these longer telephoto ranges, your depth of field, especially if your subject gets closer to you, is razor thin. And if you want more than just the beak or the eye to be in focus, then you probably do want to stop down slightly from that maximum wide aperture. Typically when I'm photographing, I have a single focus point and I move that around and put it on my subject. When you're photographing wildlife though, especially wildlife that might move, it's helpful to allow the camera to give you a little bit more help. So move up to kind of a group or even a wider spread of points that's going to allow the camera to find your subject and to track it if it moves. Now, we're in a bit of a transition time here, where typically I've rarely recommended using continuous autofocus unless the subject was coming directly toward you or directly away from you. But these days, the continuous autofocus is getting much, much better and is better at predicting and tracking a moving subject and can be helpful. So it really depends on your camera, but you should play with those continuous autofocus settings. It allows the camera to continually be refocusing as that subject is moving, and it's going to give you much better results, especially with faster moving subjects if you're using that method or that mode. And that's it. Those are just some quick tips for better wildlife photos, especially with longer lenses. And as I said, gear links and recommendations are right down below, and I invite your questions and comments down there as well. If you found this video helpful, take a moment to hit that thumbs up button, and don't forget to subscribe for more gear reviews, tips, tricks, and travel videos. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.